Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into what has to be one of the most heartbreaking, dramatic, and honestly consequential stories in the entire history of the Ottoman Empire. We're going to look at the life and the incredibly tragic death of Şehzade Mustafa. This is a story about a brilliant prince, a father's paralyzing paranoia, and the devastating real-world consequences of absolute power. Mustafa was the eldest son of Suleiman the Magnificent, and his story isn't just a sad footnote. It's widely considered a massive historical turning point. It was a moment that literally shook the public's trust in the state to its core.
Now, Mustafa wasn't just a popular guy. To everyone around them, he was known simply as the future sultan. And I mean everyone. This wasn't just some hopeful wish whispered by his mother in the palace hallways. This was the universal consensus. The military, the seasoned statesmen, and the everyday citizens of the empire, they all viewed Mustafa as the absolute, undeniable heir to the throne. To them, he was already the next ruler in waiting. He was this massive beacon of hope for the empire's future. But, as we're going to see, in the cutthroat world of the Ottoman court, universal love could actually be the single most dangerous thing a prince could possess.
Section 1. Birth of an heir. Hope for the empire. Every great tragedy starts with a moment of profound hope, right? The year is 1515. Mustafa is born in the province of Manisa. At this time, his father, Suleiman the Magnificent, was actually still just a prince himself, and Mustafa's mother was hurremsultan. When little Mustafa was born, a massive wave of joy just swept through the Ottoman realm. Why? Because the dynasty had finally been gifted a strong, healthy male heir. The continuation of the royal bloodline seemed securely guaranteed in the form of this robust young boy. As Mustafa grew up, he basically became the blueprint for the ideal prince. We're talking a world-class education here. He mastered Arabic and Persian, and he was rigorously trained in the really intricate arts of statecraft and warfare. But, it wasn't just his resume that made him special, it was his personality. Historical sources describe him as incredibly intelligent, charismatic, and remarkably brave. And despite his royal blood, he had this humble, grounded nature that made him deeply connected to the common people and deeply, deeply revered by the fierce Janissary soldiers. He was just the perfect balance of a scholar and a warrior. Moving on to Section 2, the throne system, survival of the fittest. To really grasp how tragic his fall was, we have to look at the absolutely brutal environment he was born into. See, the Ottoman Empire didn't have a strict rule saying the oldest son automatically gets the throne. There was no law of primogeniture. Instead, the throne was claimed by whoever was the strongest and most capable. It was literally survival of the fittest. And historically, this led to some devastating civil wars and fratricide between brothers. Because there was no legal guarantee to the throne, Mustafa's immense popularity didn't just make him a beloved leader, it painted a massive, glowing target right on his back. So to prep for this inevitable royal showdown, princes were sent out to govern provinces in what was called the Sanjak system. Mustafa served first in Manisa, and then he was assigned to Amasya. Now, Amasya was incredibly critical because it sat right near the dangerous Iranian border. This wasn't just some administrative desk job. It was a highly strategic military assignment. And while he was governing there, Mustafa gained invaluable military experience, expanded his popular support, and built a deeply loyal, powerful circle of followers. He was checking every single box needed to become the ultimate survivor of this succession system. Which brings us to Section 3, Palace Intrigues, Hurremsultan's Rise. Far away from the rugged battlefields of Amasya, a totally different kind of war was brewing back in the capital. It was like a giant chess game, and the palace split into two massive factions. On side one, you've got Şehzade Mustafa, his mother Mahidevran, the fierce backing of the army and seasoned statesmen. It's a very public, battle-ready alliance. But then, on side two, you have Hurremsultan. She had become Suleiman's powerful favorite and had borne him several sons of her own, Mehmed, Selim, Bayezid, and Cihangir. Understandably, Hurrem fiercely wanted the throne for her own bloodline, so she allied with the Grand Vizier, Rüstem Pasha, and they formed this incredibly strategic, tight-knit inner palace circle. Now, for a long time, Mustafa had this incredibly powerful shield in the capital. His name was Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha, a man of immense influence over the state, and a very close supporter of the prince. But when Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha was executed, everything flipped. His fall left Mustafa dangerously isolated in the palace. Without his absolute strongest political ally whispering in the Sultan's ear, Mustafa was entirely exposed to the political maneuvering of Hurremsultan's faction. Over the years, the pressure just kept building toward a breaking point. Let's look at the timeline. In 1536, Mustafa loses Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha.
Then, in 1543, Hurremsultan's eldest son, Şehzade Mehmed, tragically dies at a young age. This completely shifted Hurrem's focus to securing the throne for her remaining sons, Selim and Bayezid, which exponentially increased the pressure on Mustafa. Finally, we reach 1553, the year of the fateful Iran campaign. The pressure cooker is literally about to explode.
Section 4. Suleiman's Fear, the Great Betrayal.
All that tension that had been bubbling under the surface for decades, it was about to be weaponized. During the 1553 military campaign against Iran, a terrifying narrative began to spread through the palace. Whispers and rumors started circulating that Şehzade Mustafa was preparing to rebel and seize the throne. And the primary architect of this narrative, according to historical consensus, was Rüstem Pasha. It's widely alleged that Rüstem Pasha presented Suleiman with fake letters, essentially manufacturing evidence that Mustafa was conspiring to overthrow him. Now, to be completely impartial here, absolute concrete proof of the forgery is lost to time. But historians overwhelmingly agree that this was a massive, highly orchestrated political operation.
But you've got to ask yourself, why would Suleiman the Magnificent, literally one of history's most brilliant rulers, fall for this? Well, it stems from the terrifying precedent set by Yavuz Sultan Selim. Suleiman's own father had actually rebelled against and overthrown his grandfather to take the throne. The trauma of that history absolutely haunted Suleiman. When he looked at Mustafa, a prince who was incredibly strong, heavily armed, and unconditionally loved by the military, Suleiman didn't just see a son. He saw his father's history repeating itself. He became completely gripped by the paralyzing fear that he was going to be violently deposed. And that deep-seated fear, it led to what is arguably the most traumatic, heartbreaking moment in Ottoman history. Let's walk through exactly what happened at the army camp in Konya Eregli in 1553. First, Mustafa is summoned to his father's tent. Second, despite his advisors pleading with him not to go, he enters. He fully believes in his own innocence and his father's mercy. Third, the very second he steps inside, he's ambushed, not by his father, but by mute executioners. Fourth, because Mustafa was incredibly strong and capable, he didn't just go down. He fought back fiercely, fighting for his life. But finally, tragically, he was overpowered and he was strangled to death with a bowstring. Section 5. The verdict. Tears of history. The physical struggle inside that tent finally ended, but the shockwaves of this execution, they would ripple through the empire for centuries. The immediate fallout was just devastating. Some sources actually claim that Suleiman the Magnificent was standing right behind a curtain in the tent, listening to the entire horrific struggle. When the news finally broke, the janissaries, the statesmen, and the public erupted into absolute outrage. They had just lost the people's prince. And perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of this whole aftermath is the fate of Mustafa's half-brother, Şehzade Cihangir. Cihangir loved Mustafa deeply, and shortly after the execution, he literally died from the sheer psychological grief and trauma of losing his brother. This massive collective grief was actually immortalized by the famous poet Tashlij Yahya, who composed a Mersiye, or an elegy, for Mustafa. This piece quickly became one of the most important works of mourning literature in all of Ottoman history. Through his poetry, Yahya channeled the fury of the people. He indirectly, but undeniably, condemned Rüstem Pasha and the dark palace intrigues that murdered their brightest star. It was basically a poetic rebellion against the shadows of the court. So, looking back, what is the final verdict of history? To be completely impartial here, there is no smoking gun document sitting in an archive that absolutely proves hurremsultan and Rüstem Pasha's explicit guilt in a forgery. However, historians overwhelmingly view them as the driving force behind the political framing of Mustafa. And on top of that, historians have debated for centuries whether Suleiman the Magnificent suffered from a profound, lifelong remorse for killing a son who is arguably his most capable heir entirely out of political paranoia. We're going to wrap up this explainer with one of the most fascinating what-if questions ever posed in alternate history. What if Mustafa had survived and actually taken the throne? Historians speculate that the Ottoman Empire might have become even more fiercely warrior-centric, with a completely different dynamic between the Sultan and the military. We're never going to know for sure. But what we do know is that Şehzade Mustafa remains the ultimate symbol of the harsh, absolute, and deeply tragic nature of power. His story forces us to wonder just how different the world might have been if the people's prince had lived to wear the crown. Thank you so much for joining me, and as always, keep questioning the history you think you know.